You're tuned into the Zelos podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder, and this week, Kirby Retzer's in the house with me. Kirby is strength conditioning coach for the Boston Red Sox. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of things, from the minors to the DR to his career path and more. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder, SNYDER. Click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any weekly episode. And while you're at it, check out the courses that I have lined up on my website, rockysnyder.com. We're going to be talking about it because Kirby actually uses the foam wedges or the foot wedges with his athletes. Yeah, that's right. The Red Sox are using the foot wedges. Find out why. Well, you can actually just go to my website, sign up for one of the courses online or in person. In fact, I'm going to be in the Boston area September 23rd at Physio X Physical Therapy Facility, where I'll be teaching a one-day workshop, all hands-on, about using those foam wedges. You can sign up on my website. Back to the show. All right, I get to have a treat this week because, as you know, I'm a Boston native, and even though I've been a California transplant for more than 30 years, my heart is still in Fenway Park, and any chance to get with anybody in the Red Sox organization, I jump at, and that's why Kirby Retzer's on with me this week. And Kirby's down in Fort Myers, Florida, where he's taking care of MLIB, the DR, the farm team organization, and so on, with his role as strength conditioning coach. So Kirby, hey, welcome to Zelos. Great to have you on here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to talking.
Right on. So right out of the gate, I would love to know what your career path has been, like your backstory, your superhero origin, however you want to call it. Where did you come from, and how did you get where you are today?
Yeah, I'm from the eastern coast of Florida, like Boca Raton, Deerfield Beach, right by FAU. So I played high school baseball, had a chance to study exercise science and go play baseball for Florida Gulf Coast University on the western coast of Florida. So took a 2-hour drive across the state, started there in 2010, fall of 2010. Always knew like I wanted to study exercise science, like had some injuries and stuff in high school. Not a lot of people could fix them. Met one guy that like really was able to help me out, and that like really sparked my interest in it. And then, so my first year had surgery, had a red shirt, but then played my second year. And then it got really hard. It was at the point where like anybody that's been through an exercise science, like undergraduate program, I think can attest to this. It's like, it's dense. It's a lot, especially like if you have an opportunity to have an immersive experience and do an internship, which Florida Gulf Coast University kind of had set up. So like the junior year was really difficult because in your senior year, you were able to do something called experiential learning, where you go out into the field and all of your schooling is done online, and you go do a 40-hour plus internship anywhere in the country that you want. You could set up an affiliation agreement with anybody. So the organization in town had an affiliation agreement set up with the Boston Red Sox. So like, I was like, all right, am I a good enough baseball player to like go and play in the big leagues and do this for the rest of my life? Like ultimately saw people that were better than me that weren't getting the chance to go play. I was like, all right, it's time to start a career in this that I really like. And maybe it could ultimately work out to where I was able to stay in baseball, right? So right before my junior season, I stopped to take an internship with the Red Sox. So I started with them in the summer of my junior year. And yeah, kind of been in pro ball since. So I took my senior year internship, finished. They wanted me to stay on with the team, but baseball at that time really didn't have full-time opportunities for minor league strength and conditioning coaches.
Oh, really?
It would have been an unpaid internship, like really just kind of going and working for experience. And I would have gone to Lowell.
Yeah. You're better off. No offense to people in Lowell.
Yeah, I know, right? So yeah, after I graduated, it was go to Lowell and don't get paid, or Minnesota Twins were actually right up the road. And the coordinator with the Red Sox like put my name in, and my wife at the time, who was my girlfriend at the time, coming out of college, was living here. So it just kind of made a lot of sense to like start a career here, put some roots in the ground in Fort Myers. So her and I kind of hunkered in, and I worked the summer of 2014 into the fall of 2014, and then all of 2015 with Minnesota. And then in the Florida Complex League, or the Gulf Coast League at that time. So that was kind of how I started. And then the Red Sox were expanding their staffing and had full-time opportunities available now. And I really wanted to come back. I wanted to see the upper levels of minor league baseball. So had the opportunity to go and work in Pawtucket. So in 2016, I went and worked with our AAA team, and I did that for 3 years. And that was a really cool experience, seeing
Right
like the
on.
lowest levels and then seeing like basically Major League Baseball and like how you can manage Major League depth and keep that player group healthy. So yeah, I did that 16, 17, and 18. And then the climate of baseball at that time was, once you get to the upper levels, there wasn't much more development that was going on. And like I said, I kind of got into this, one, to develop players, but like also to like keep them healthy and stuff. And during my time in Pawtucket, I did an online master's degree through AT Still in like motor learning and orthopedic rehab. It made me like super interested in the rehabilitative process as a whole, and like how to like try skill acquisition and that whole all those models. And so, and at the time too, like my wife was in Florida, so I was like, all right, well, I can move back to Florida, kind of put some true roots into the ground and kind of maybe oversee our rehab process. So in 19, I came down to Florida, and kind of been here since. So yeah, 19, 20, I coordinated our rehab. And then in 21, I was our assistant coordinator. And now is my second year as coordinator. So got to see everything, like from affiliate strength and conditioning coach to rehab strength and conditioning coach, and now kind of overseeing a staff of 15, kind of all across the world.
Oh man, you bring up so many things I want to ask you about now. Okay, so first of all, you mentioned something that it didn't really hit home to me until right now, where you mentioned, when you get up to the big leagues and you're in the majors, the athletes have reached, for the most part, the zenith of performance, where they have developed to now where it's just minute fine tuning here and there, but ultimately they are at the level where they have reached their peak in some ways. But down in the minors and the farm teams and maybe getting up into the AAA, you've got a lot more room for improvement. So being a strength conditioning coordinator and designing programs and really developing players, you're really in the trenches when you're down in Florida compared to being at Fenway, which doesn't take away for anything from the staff in Fenway, but just it seems like there's so much more involved with what you're doing down in Florida with that. Is that kind of accurate?
Yeah. So what do you learn in school, right? You learn that you do two things. You learn that you improve performance, and then you help to reduce injury, right? Like those are the two adages that you always hear. But like you always heard that, but it never really started to kind of reign true and like really help me internalize like what those things meant until we had a sports science department and we had some ways to like truly objectify our own internal data and start to understand like what those things even are. So to your point, like, okay, in Boston, what is performance? Performance is keeping those guys healthy so that they can go play and compete. Because at that point, you're not going to try to chase this performance piece because they've spent so many years doing that. But like, what is the performance piece? And like, what as strength and conditioning personnel or performance people can we do to influence that? And I think that's probably been the most like resounding thing is like, I think we used to just chase performance as this like big umbrella, whereas now almost seeing it as position specific, right? So physical output changes can help pitchers how? Mainly in how fast they throw the baseball. So throwing velocity. For position players, it would be twofold. It would be how fast they can run so they can get to more baseballs, or they can kind of get around the base paths faster, create more runs, prevent more runs, in those two facets. And with position players, even swing the bat faster to impact the baseball harder, to create more exit velocity, to create more hits or even more damage, right? So like we think about it in terms of foot speed, arm speed, and hand speed, and the ways that those things translate to the field, that's now performance. Like, yes, you may win on the margins a little bit at the upper levels, but if you get a 16 to 18-year-old kid from the Dominican Republic or coming out of the draft out of high school, yeah, you have a longer development window where you can actually do those things. And then at the same time, also do the things that you're trying to do at the upper levels, which is mitigate injury risk. You know, if we know that there's imbalances in muscle function or range of motion or or like carrying too much adipose tissue. We know those things carry risk, right? So it's about mitigation of risk of these things that we know in the literature and our own internal data, like add risk to injury stratifications. And then also on the other side of things, like the elements of speed that we feel somewhat confident that we can impact, even if it's a small amount.
Wow. Yeah, it makes complete sense. I just never really kind of sat back and looked at it from a perspective like that. So the guys in the majors, then we're talking about when it comes to performance, like you say, I could see it being some motor neurology and biomechanics. How do we get just the last elements, that the fraction of an inch, a fraction of a second faster with the bat speed, faster with the pitching arm, or the reaction time, really. And so now we're talking about really brain function, and can we tap into that for more efficiency, faster reactions, and so on, in which you're probably doing at the lower levels, but really there's so many more things to introduce into an overall program for somebody that's in the DR, that's coming over to the Florida. What's the league called? What do you used to call it the Citrus League, but what do you call it?
Yeah, Florida Complex League.
Yeah, Florida Complex League. Thank you. So very cool. Okay, just putting a little bit of a spin here. You mentioned that you were injured in high school and saw the approach that was taken there that inspired you with kind of injury mitigation, strength conditioning, and so on. And I see you as kind of in a generation where you're past a certain cusp. And what I mean by that is, let's just take the 90s, we don't even, and before, the 90s and before, and maybe the early 2000s, where the approach was still very compartmentalized, very isolated in nature in terms of strength and rehab. If somebody had a symptom, then they were going to focus on the symptomatic sites without taking into consideration the body as a whole integrative mechanical unit, where we might find in today's understanding that you've got a pitcher who broke his left toe some time ago, and it didn't fully rehab and heal because it's something that isn't looked at as a huge monumental event. But nowadays we look at it and go, oh, well, that's going to affect hip extension or loading into this foot, loading into this leg. It's going to have a whole effect on the kinematic sequence of a pitching throw. So I see you on that side of the fence now. Am I right with that? Like, your whole approach sounds much more holistic rather than isolated in nature and symptom based.
Yeah, I think it has to be. I think there's just too much information out there to continue to treat things in isolation.
And so tell me, just walk me through, like, you're a big part of the rehab process, and that was actually your role for a little while. What is entailed with that? Can you give us like a general overview of like the return to play protocols or procedures as you bring people back onto the diamond?
Yeah, it starts with, like, before the player comes in. Okay, so the player comes in, right, and goes through an intake process within
Sure.
anything that they can do. Just take common in baseball these days is like an ulnar collateral ligament reconstruction or what have you, right? So coming back from Tommy John. So if the player was a part of our system before and got surgery, what we would do would be to review all of the data that player had prior to surgery. Once the player gets surgery and comes back, like normally when they're still casted, we'll sit them down and we'll review it all with them. And when I say we, I mean the strength and conditioning personnel, the physical therapist, the mental skills coach, our nutritionist, and then our like a biomechanical representative, somebody from that staff. And we try to look at everything like holistically and see, okay, who were you before? What are the things that added risk, that inhibited a little bit of performance for you? And like, what are some things that we can help you with moving forward? So we try to like aggregate everything, sit them down, and then establish goals for each department and then track them throughout the process. That's as zoomed out as it gets. And the player then, I think, understands that like we're coming at them and we're trying to understand all of their injury history back to high school, like as much as our medical records can provide. Like we try to understand everything that may have, and like really unearth it and take time to go past the surface level, because with 200 players, you can't take an hour and a half and do that with each of them, right? Like, and especially all the time on the back end. The meeting itself will last a while, right? But like all the effort on the back end to really unearth all those things, it takes a lot of time. So like that's really, I think, what separates our rehab approach and our execution of rehabs that from other organizations and other people. Like it's multidisciplinary. You try to take a lot of the history into account, and then you try to set up established goals that are like objective and even subjective, the ones that the player would like, and then periodically remeasure them as well and follow up and see if there's change. And if there's not, like establish reasons and get to the reasons why they might not be improving. And the one thing that I'll say there, I think the biggest part of the rehab process that we've learned over the years is that the successful ones, the guys that win the time away from the ballpark, and they win the mental game. Like the away from the ballpark is kind of the mental game, because a lot of the programs that you go through are not going to be a whole lot different, right? They may have some nuance based on things that you need, but I mean, think about the amount of time that's spent away from the ballpark. It's probably almost a third of the amount of, like, if a third away, 2/3 at the ballpark, right?
Yeah.
So if you if you lose the third, like if you're not sleeping the right way, if you're not eating the right way, if your mental landscape isn't in a good place because of family stressors or things like that, like the people that can manage that third of the experience, right? The year-long experience and all those little drops in the bucket. I think we've seen the people that win the mental game during the rehab process have been the ones that have had the most success.
Do you have a way of assessing that? Like, is there whether it's like a Binet personality test or something of that nature, or is it just something that you kind of observe, witness, go, okay, this guy's got it, this guy needs help? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it's more art at this point. Our mental skills department, I think, has more nuance and layers to it. But I think it's just as simple as like eating the right way, or buying or renting an apartment rather, up the road, and cooking meals at the house, and making sure that you're having like quality sleep every night. Like as cheesy it is, I think it's just about doing the fundamentals really well. Not necessarily a type of personality. It's just about like dominating the basics when you're having to show up and do the same thing every day for 8 months. It takes a certain sort of grit and mental fortitude to weather that storm in that process, amongst all the other things that you have going on as just a general person.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. All right. So when it comes to, say, physical injuries, and you mentioned health history, and you look back as far as you can with their medical records and so on, are there certain injuries that are kind of like your red flag zone, where these top 4 injuries, if one of them is appearing in their health history, then we need to be a little bit more concerned with their biomechanics, their kinematic sequencing for swinging a bat or throwing a ball? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know necessarily that we're there yet at scale.
Okay.
But I think to your point about the big toe, I think like if there are injuries, then we investigate, right? And I think like you take a little bit more time going through a testing battery than you would previously. Like we have a player now with like a shoulder labrum, right? But had a previous knee issue in the past. So like we have machinery here, Biodex, where we can get strength profiles at different speeds and understand, like, is there still residual strength decrements in his ability to flex and extend his knee, right? And then was there transient issues in his ankle, like range of motion of the ankle and hip joint as well, right? Like not just taking it off face value that got better. So I'd say at scale, we don't have something that we like say, okay, this and that have a relationship. However, like per player during the injury process, we try to do our due diligence to ensure that things got better when we assumed that they did.
Yeah. Okay. So with your with your master's degree, a big part of that was injury mitigation, return to play. Uh, how do you take that information and overlay it into what you're doing now? Like, is first of all, the information that you got in your schooling, is it pretty applicable to what you're doing today, or do you notice that, okay, this was just the fundamentals, and now what we're doing here is actually much more advanced than what I received in my degree?
Yeah, I think similar to what I was kind of referring to with the rehab guys winning the time away from the ballpark, doing the fundamentals. That was
Yeah.
really like the master's program taught me the fundamentals of motor learning. And one of them that really has continued to stick out to me was like dynamic systems theory and Gentile's taxonomy of motor skills. Like those two in particular were super like interesting to me. So the dynamic systems theory, like taking organismic constraints and layering those in with different constraints in your environment and with tasks, like that process was really cool to understand, because prior to 2019, we didn't really have much skill acquisition going on in our department from a baseball standpoint. So I was able
Uh-huh.
to help like our pitching coordinator layer in some of the strategies that we now use to help players learn new skills from a motor learning perspective. So that was really fascinating. Now we have Rob Gray on staff, and like it's really cool to have seen that go through. So that was a big part of my master's degree that like wasn't particularly strength and conditioning, but it had benefit, a massive benefit.
Can you give an example of the skills acquisitions, like, yeah, of drills or potential outcomes? Like, what are we
Yeah.
talking about?
So like, let me just zoom out real quick. So the dynamic systems theory, I don't think I would have had as much success understanding that if it wasn't preceded by the Gentile's taxonomy of motor skills, because what that and like the principle of systematicity. So those two things are in essence working from an environment of stability and control to an environment of more complexity, right?
Got it.
So, and then systematicity, like that's basically the principle of Hebbian learning, where neurons that wire together, fire together, wire together, right? And going from positions that I can control to positions that I can't control, and allowing the things that I can control, adding in information to something that I can already attach it to, rather than just bringing in foreign information that I can't attach it to. So if I'm trying, so the example that you asked was like, give me an example, right? Okay. So we had a big effort to help our players better understand how to leverage their drive leg as they move from the start of the windup or start of the stretch, as they carry their stack down the mound. How can they better establish their center of mass and carry their weight down the mound to transition that and create linear energy and then translate it into rotational energy.
Mm-hmm.
At times we had players that were not creating energy towards home plate. They were losing it into their toe anteriorly and not creating efficient linear energy, which caused them to spin off and not create good directional rotational energy. So what we helped them to do is find a good stable like hinge and hinge to ride prior to rotation. So they wouldn't, like as a right-handed pitcher, I wouldn't drift to third base and then spin off early. I'd be able to carry my stack down the mound and create rotation from that position. So like using the taxonomy of skills and using dynamic systems theory, like we help to move from like a really stable base to an unstable base and use isometrics, because we know like that gives you the most spatial awareness qualities, and then how to place resistance and how to feed into some of the mistakes that were happening, and then how to help players create tension and work out of some of the positions that they were dealing with. And now that's transitioned into a lot of like unstable and variable environments with the use of water. But I don't know that the use of water implements would have gone as well if the players didn't have an innate understanding of what they were trying to do and control those positions. So I think the foundational isometric work and then them understanding just how to like manage their base of support, or manage their center of mass over their base of support in the beginning. I don't know that it would have gone as well without that.
Okay, when you say the use of water, are we talking like cylinders somewhat filled with water, and now we've got this mass shifting around, creating a chaos? Or are we talking like having them in a pool where they've got a lot more resistance all around them? What do you mean by incorporating water?
The your first notion.
Okay, all right. So it's just it's the shifting of resistance in a chaotic fashion, and then therefore they've got to kind of counter that and find stability as their world is kind of shifting all over the place.
Correct.
Okay, and also what I hear you saying is body centration is pretty critical in regards to converting linear to rotational speed or force production. So meaning that you want to have the body maintain a fairly good vertical axis and maintain a nice stacking so that you're not creating a whole bunch of different force vectors up the chain, but you're maintaining this one pure vector in which you can convert linear power to rotational power.
Yeah, mitigate injury leaks.
So how do you do that?
I think like that drill package that I sort of alluded to has been one of like the ways that we've had success with that. So that's a lot more on our pitching coaches. The way that we work with them is to help players and the staff understand if they have movement limitations where they can and can't do that, right? So if, for example, are you familiar with the Y balance test?
Yes.
So if that's one screening process that we use. So if a guy has a hard time with his drive leg creating single leg stability or has inherent weakness in maybe some of his hip musculature, and a pitching coach comes to us and say, hey, this player is having a hard time creating a hinge, carrying his center of mass down the mound with that leg. What are you seeing in the weight room? We can help them to understand, okay, this isn't a motor learning problem. Like there is some movement limitations that he has inherently in that hip that may be preventing him from controlling positions on the mound. If he can't do it
All
in a
right.
very stable, controlled environment in the weight room, he's going to have a hard time doing it in a complex, more chaotic environment.
Got
So
it.
that's kind of the first step, is helping to sift out, is it a movement limitation? Or does this person have all the mobility and the stability needed to do this? And now he needs to learn the skill of baseball. So that,
Nice.
I think that's been the biggest clear like line in the sand is it skill acquisition, or is it, mobility or stability oriented things?
All right, and for the listening audience not familiar with the Y balance test, essentially you're standing on a plastic box with PVC tubes going directly behind you and then two going off in front of you to like 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. They each have these plastic boxes attached so you can slide along the PVC tubes, and you stand on one platform with one foot, and with the other foot you're pushing the tube out as far as you can. You can measure the distance so you can see if there's asymmetries, imbalances, if the person can really extend through their hip and reach back while flexing on the standing leg. It covers sagittal, frontal, transverse plane, hip stability and mobility. The Greg Cook and Lee Burton, Greg Rose, they're the ones who kind of came up with it with the FMS system. And Move to Perform, I think, is the website you can go to for more information on that. That's great. So, okay, Kirby, I just want to keep on going deeper into the weeds with you because you're giving me some great insight here. We're talking about really disrupting patterns at the same time, because if we find that they have the mobility and stability, but for whatever reason, they don't have the skill, they could be basically riding on a compensatory pattern from previous injuries that need to be disrupted and given a new experience that's more efficient. So the brain goes, oh yeah, I don't have to do this old pattern that I created to get around this injury I had before, whether it's a high hamstring pull, low back, labral tear, whatever the case is. It's going to manifest completely through the entire integrative chain of this player. So I know that you have become introduced to anatomy and motion and foot wedges, which is kind of that's my backyard. I'm wondering, is that part of it? Like when you're dealing with these athletes and we're talking about trying to create better stability, better centration, better center of better base center of mass over there, base support. Are you utilizing those, or what's your approach? I mean, I'm sure it's multifaceted, but what are some of the tools or approaches that you use to kind of get into this situation?
Yeah, so we have our assessments and our training like are built off like a set of KPIs. So we look at first the body, is the weight and lean mass, like is their body, what is their body composition composed of, right? Because regardless of any of the movement limitations that you may have, if you're carrying excess fat, it's not advantageous. Okay, so that was kind of the first one.
Okay.
Second layer is force and symmetry. So like force and range of motion, I should say. So I apologize. So you have force and you have range. So are you creating symmetrical force and do you have symmetrical range? It is an asymmetrical sport. However, we value and biological systems value symmetry in terms of locomotion. As you look at external internal rotation, there'd be obviously variations there due to all the things that we understand. But in general, torso function, limb function, there should be some symmetry there, and in force output as well. So for force output and for range, we have ways to measure range, but we also have versions of dynamometry, fixed dynamometry, to determine positional control and force output and hip ab and adduction, shoulder internal external rotation, full cans. And within force and within range, like I said, we value symmetry, but we also value you compared to you and your historical change over time. So are you getting weaker? Are there decrements? Is there a loss of range? Like those things in the cemented patterns that we've established that we value, we monitor those and we evaluate those. And we try to progress those over time. Thirdly is capacity. Like we have conditioning tests and forms of capacity to better understand, like, are you prepared to meet the demands of this game, especially with the change in pitch clock, understanding the demands of position player, running yardages. We really value capacity and monitoring changes in workload. So that's our fourth main thing that we really value and hold true to is using GPS technology for position players, and then having a general eye on workload for pitchers and throw counts. And then we use a force deck software and counter movement jumping to evaluate in a controlled setting how you display force. This is the same configuration every week, every 2 weeks, same configuration, same setup. How is your neuromuscular system adapting to the training stimulus and the game loads that you are seeing? How much force are you putting into the ground? How fast are you putting it into the ground? How fast are you pushing out from that position that you just got to? Is your counter movement depth changing at all? Is your height output, changing? So like we have these main rooted KPIs that we value that we challenge players to be better than others in their category. Like if you're a center fielder, how do you compare to all other center fielders? And then how do you compare to you? Like, are you better than you were last year or are you not? So to answer your question, like back to how we originally started this whole conversation, it really is a generalistic thing. And I think if we can win on the margins with every single little part of that equation, we'll win in the long term, rather than saying, okay, we're going to have the best Nordic hamstring curl of anybody in all of baseball to prevent hamstring injuries. Like that is a part of what we do, but it's also about, okay, we're not going to carry excess fat. We're going to definitely manage workload. We're going to get sprint exposures every 3 to 5 days. We're going to make sure we're sleeping better than any other team in baseball. And we're going to make sure you ate a pregame meal and you're hydrated. Like we're going to dominate the fundamentals across the board this deep, rather than that deep on one thing. Is how I think like we treat players and kind of treat our system as a whole. Foot wedges are a part of what we do in the rehab setting. The way that you interact with the ground is massively important. We had a guy recently coming back from a hamstring injury, had a setback, and he had an ankle sprain 1.5 years ago. And, we definitely needed to reevaluate how well his foot interacted with the ground. And those were tools that we used to reestablish his ability to pronate and create global internal rotation and force impulse into the ground, right? So like those were the tools that we probably should have gotten from the beginning, but now we made an adjustment, and his ability to symmetrically pronate, internally rotate, and create force into the ground is now better. So they're tools. They're super useful.
So I just kind of circling back to symmetry, asymmetry. Uh, you mentioned, yes, it's a very asymmetrical sport that you're in, whether golf, baseball, and to some degree tennis, but at least tennis, you've got a forehand and a backhand. So they kind of balance out to some degree, but nonetheless, there is this tremendous reinforcement of these sport patterns that will continually pull an individual out of the ideal aligned position. So trying to get them to be as symmetrical as possible while they're creating these asymmetrical actions. And there is a certain school of thought that is thinking, I don't want to mess with that because we may be messing with their athletic ability, their precision, their targeting, and their force production and so on. And yet for me, and my own kind of anecdotal experience with clients and athletes, sure, I'm not going to try and create symmetry when they're heading to a championship round. I'm not going to try and mess with them there. But leading through the beginning of the season all the way through mid-season, that's opportunity to try to get them to be balanced. And as they get more to the pinnacles of championship season, I'm going to kind of just put that off on the side unless injuries start to come up, and then I might bring it back in to mitigate that. But is that kind of your approach too in regards to symmetry and asymmetry, or are you constantly kind of having it in the background?
Yeah, it's constant. Like I think the shoulder, elbow, wrist it's a different ball game, right? Like we're not going to view shoulder external rotation on the right arm as the same as the left arm, right? Okay, so
Makes
like
sense. Yeah.
shoulder independently, thinking about the spine, thinking about pelvis, thinking about knee ankle function, right?
Sure.
Like I would be hard pressed to get like convinced otherwise because of the amount of literature that's out there about symmetry and about like range and force in increasing risk of injury, right? So if I have a player that comes, okay, so let's just start two examples. Okay, we come in the draft and new player shows up. Okay, he has a 15-degree difference in ankle dorsiflexion, a 4-inch reach difference in the Y balance, and resultant atrophy in that limb that doesn't have as much range. And then let's see, when tested, force output wise, like knee extension, knee flexion, strength also have like a 10 to 15% decrement.
Yeah, that's a red flag for me.
So like, while there may not currently, and he has a clean injury history, right? But if you sit down and you think about, okay, we want you to play for the next 10 years, you want to normalize some of those things so that in locomotion, in running gait, you have an equal distribution of force. So that's kind of the way that we think about it for a new player coming in. And then for an other player, so like, okay, so say you're on a playoff run or you're going through a season, right? And you have a player that normally was symmetrical and all those things that we just mentioned, but then you see, okay, we start to see a slow loss of range of that ankle. We see a slow change from just a half-inch difference in Y balance to almost 2 now. And then we see on the Nordic or on our dynamometer, like versions of force output, we see that symmetry change from like 5 to 6 to 8, maybe up to 12 to 15. Now we see a slow change in how the body is adapting to the stresses of baseball. I think the same thing rings true, right? Like, why is this change happening? Why is the body maladapting to one side? And then in the torso, like we evaluate thoracic rotation. We don't currently evaluate force through the spine, but we evaluate range. So, okay, if there wasn't previously symmetry, but now I'm losing the ability to rotate right as a right-handed thrower, that helps me to be able to decelerate my spine, as I move through these positions. So I would be hard pressed, even amongst success on field and performance change, I'd be hard pressed to not slowly resolve it. And that's the thing too. It's like, we're not pushing the fire alarm saying we need to resolve all these things tomorrow and you can't play baseball until they're fixed. It would, if in the amount of time that it took for those things to onset, we would take a similar amount of time to reverse course and reestablish homeostasis and balance.
Sure. Do you get any pushback from players or coaches?
No.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's great. It's become kind of an accepted way of doing things then.
Yeah, and like I said in the beginning when I started, like there was no full-time positions. You had to get a seat at the table, and now like we're the first organization in all of professional baseball to have a full-time strength and conditioning coach and a part-time strength and conditioning coach at every minor league team, every minor league affiliate. No other team in baseball has that.
Right on. Okay.
So like it speaks to
it speaks to the Red Sox organization is what I'll say right there. Yes. Hell yeah. Okay. Best and worst part of your job.
Worst part is the amount of time that professional sports takes out of your life, and the amount of time that it takes as a whole. Long season, we start mid-January, really getting guys going, and we don't finish until probably middle of October, end of October. Team gets, through the World Series, you're looking at the first week of November, right? So you really get Thanksgiving through the new year off, where you're not running it pretty hard. So that would probably be the biggest negative it turns into your life. It is your life. So you really better like it, which fortunately I do. But I'm a new father. I'm a husband. I'm a son. Like I'm a friend. Like it does take away from your ability to do other things rather than be a professional strength and conditioning coach. So that I think that would be probably the hardest thing. Probably the worst thing, if you would say.
Sure.
Best thing, I think I've seen it, like had the opportunity to change people's lives. A few players, having gone through that rehab process, are better baseball players than they were before, and because of small efforts on our end as performance staff, as strength and conditioning staff, as medical personnel, helping them to get better at that has changed their lives and maybe the lives of those that are close to them. And I think that's probably been the best part is seeing the change that it can make in people, and seeing like learning from other people, really like seeing, I would have never gotten familiar with Spanish or eaten some of the foods or like learned cultures the way that I think that I have learned, mainly about like the Latin American culture, if it wasn't here. So I kind of cheated and gave you two answers for the best. First one is changing people's lives, but like the cultural piece was really cool that I'm not sure that I would have experienced if it wasn't for this game.
That's right on. That's really cool. Okay. How about like one of your success stories? Without naming names or anything, you got a player that you as soon as I say a success story, that's the one that comes to mind. Give me a little bit of a share time with that.
Yeah, college draft player, came through, was doing really well, had Tommy John surgery, and then through the rehab process, worked through a lot of strife, worked through the pandemic, which wasn't easy. A lot of this stuff was done remotely, came back, had another setback, and then ultimately now is contributing at the major league level, right? So that would be the one when I was kind of thinking about like the best part, like that player's career now, from what it was as not particularly somebody that I think the organization would contribute currently at the major league level that is. So I think that'd probably be one of the biggest success stories. And then an old mentor of mine, Mike Roos, that was the coordinator and director here prior to me in this role.
Yeah.
Told me something that like you're going to really appreciate not only like the players that develop, but the staff that develops. So yeah, I'd say like watching our staff members, particularly one of like our staff members, Ricky DeLuna, kind of grow into a current role that he's in now, to where he's helping oversee like our Latin American operations and growing the impact that whole academy down there in the Dominican Republic is doing. It's really cool. And like he helped change all of our dynamic warm-ups and our speed training process. And it's been really cool to see him like step into a leadership role. So.
Very cool. Okay. So when it comes to the Florida Complex League there, you've got a lot of teams. what's the proximity to other teams? Are the Sox like that? They've got their own situation here, but a block away there's another team, or is it like several towns away? Are you all spread out, or how does it work?
Yeah, in the same town, we have the Twins in Fort Myers. And then we're the southernmost team in the division with the Twins. And then as you go north in the league, you'll play them. So in spring training, it's the Grapefruit League, but in the summer, it's the Florida Complex League. So you have the Orioles in Sarasota, which are probably about an hour, a little over an hour away. You have the Braves in Northport, which is about 45 minutes. You have the Pirates who are in Bradenton, so they're about an hour and a half. The Rays in Port Charlotte, same thing, similar to Northport, about a little less than an hour. So those are kind of the teams that we play most consistently. And then once playoffs come, we'll bleed up into the Tampa area and Lakeland area, Tigers, Yankees, and all those teams on the Eastern Coast with like the Nationals and the Astros and Palm Beach and stuff. So that whole Grapefruit League is kind of broken up in the summertime based on area. So we're like Southwest Florida is kind of like our division. So
okay, and then when it comes, whether it's in season or out of season, how often do you get a chance to visit the other facilities? And I don't know about you, but anytime I'm traveling, if there's like a training facility nearby, I want to poke my head in, see how things are going there, what they have, what they don't have, and how they operate, and so on. Do you do the same thing?
no, that's actually a good thought. Like I kind of mentioned, one of the worst parts of our job is the amount of time that it takes. So
Yeah.
for a 6 o'clock game, we're at the ballpark around noon, and then we're there until almost midnight, right? So when I do travel, I don't spend much time outside of the time that I am there with our affiliates. So during the season, from April until September, October, I see each place 2 to 3 times. Usually once on the first half before the All-Star break, once on the second half after the All-Star break, and then usually a third trip somewhere in the middle. And that's to our 5 different locations. So the DR, Salem, Virginia, Greenville, South Carolina, Portland, Maine, and then Worcester, Massachusetts. So.
Right on. And if you got called up to New England, how easy would that be for you? Or you've been mentioning roots digging deep into Florida soil. Are you there to stay, or what's that like for you? Do you have any aspirations, ambitions, or anything like that?
Yeah, when I left AAA in 2018, like I was pretty clear with the front office that I didn't want to work at the upper levels, that I did want to work in development. And that's what I still do want to do. I don't have an interest in being a major league strength and conditioning coach. I do want to be a high performance director. And I think with influence in how we scout and evaluate players, all these things that we talked about, I think that there's a way to like objectively and subjectively evaluate athleticism in amateurs. And I think as the combine now grows a data set that started back in 2021, now we have 3 years of combine data. I think as we start to understand like physical output metrics and potential relationships to things on field, I think like we'll start to really have a better understanding of athleticism for a baseball player, like the NFL has done with the combine. And I think it'll be a little bit further removed than the combine for football players, and just raw output and the demands of that game compared to some of the nuances here in baseball. But I think in 5 to 10 years, I think you'll have a really good understanding of how a player moves from a biomechanical standpoint, and using that information combined with their physical ranges of motion, their force outputs, and kind of overlaying those 2 pieces of information to understand, okay, this guy is currently moving like this, we can expect X change in a certain amount of time. So like, I think that is probably what excites me the most, is potentially drafting a future Hall of Famer when somebody maybe didn't value him in that regard. So
yeah, I find that extremely exciting from a performance perspective, for sure. Okay, so last question, really, second to last, I'll say the penultimate question here is, when it comes to your high performance team, your band of merry men, so to speak, is there a missing? Is there an empty seat at the table? Is there one element, one field of study, one kind of type of professional that you're looking forward to kind of complete the mandala?
Yeah, I think what you'll see in professional baseball in the next 5 years is the establishment of biomechanics, as common as athletic training, strength and conditioning, nutrition is. I think if you sampled all organizations, they may have one on staff, maybe two. But I think in due time, each affiliate will have a representative from that department that helps to synthesize reports and to work with the skill acquisition departments and the medical departments to harmonize that player's development. That is the last part of this. I think the new era of baseball, like that started with sabermetrics in the early 2000s, and really the use of data. I think that's kind of the last frontier.
Right on. All right. So you biomechanists out there, you heard it from Kirby. He's got a seat. You might want to throw your application into the Red Sox organization. All right. Now, okay. My final question is usually just, how can people just follow your pursuits, just get more insight within your organization and yourself, websites, Instagram, social media, that type of thing?
Yes. In January, I kind of refound LinkedIn, and it's been an awesome experience for me. I never was really big into social media. I had an Instagram, I had a Twitter. It just felt kind of shallow. I didn't really understand much of it. To be honest, more of an old soul. But when LinkedIn got referred to me by a really good friend of mine, it just kind of struck a chord for me. I think it's a space that you can be a professional and kind of work and read and interact with other professionals, and it's really about this field and others that have interest in. It's a space to do that. So yeah, I would say LinkedIn.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I belong to quite a few groups within LinkedIn, whether it's emerging athletic trainers, strength coach roundtable, personal trainers, whatever it is. Yeah, there's always research coming out that, so instead of seeing kittens and puppy dogs playing with yarn or whatever, like you would on, say, Facebook or whatever, when I scroll down my homepage, there is just amazing research that's pumping out, or presentations, or different aspects to enhance what I already do. So I'm glad you're getting it too. All right, well, I'll put your LinkedIn information in the description below. But Kirby, this has been great, man. I really appreciate it. I think we may have lost a few audience members when we went deep, but that's okay. It just means that there's room for learning. And I know that there's always room for learning. And that's why I do this, because I learned so much from my guests, and you're obviously included in that. So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate your time and expertise.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Right on. And that's it for this episode of the Zelos Podcast. Thanks, Kirby and the Sox organization, for allowing this to happen. Do check out the courses I have, either in person in Needham, Massachusetts, September 23rd, just outside of Boston, or online, rockysnyder.com. Just click on events or workshops and courses. The NSCA has CEU approved for that course that's online. So check it out. We'll see you next week.